Good morning, everyone. I'm chatting. I'm Ryan Heath, by the way, if you don't know me. Back in Brussels for a little while before heading to Australia to set up Politico there. And joining me now is one of our great reporters from California, Chase DeFelice-Antonio. Welcome, Chase.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
We wanted to sort of pull behind the curtains and give you a bit of a look at what we're thinking about as we report on technology and compare and contrast California, EU, other jurisdictions. I wanted to start with a question about court cases. So here in Brussels, regulation is the comfort zone for the EU, but in the US, very hard to regulate at the federal level, which means a lot of the scrutiny and accountability for big tech companies comes out of court cases. Have you got any that you're keeping a close eye on this year that you think will shape the sector?
There are quite a few that are really important, both court cases that have kind of already transpired, and we're going to see what the fallout from those is, but then also cases that are ongoing. Obviously, earlier this year, Meta was found liable in a social media addiction trial. YouTube as well was involved in that. There's fallout from that, there's damages, but also because, as you say, a lot of times the accountability comes through the court system. That means that there's going to be more lawsuits like that get stood up by plaintiffs' attorneys, and if you're going to see more theories of that case. The Elon Musk, Sam Altman trial is ongoing. That's at its core a battle between two people, but at the same time that has really big implications potentially for the structure of OpenAI, which is obviously leading the AI revolution in the U.S. and beyond. That company's structure is something that has been regulated by California authorities, but that again, you're seeing the court cases involve themselves there. And then also, New Mexico, a state of New Mexico, the Attorney General was asking for changes to how Meta operates in the state, billions of dollars essentially worth of changes. And what you have there is Meta saying that they'd rather not operate there than than follow those rules. So court cases really are very important.
And you don't have to tell me 100% one way or the other, but speaking of that threat to not operate in a state where you have a bad judgment, we see that sometimes with tech companies where there's a sort of a doom hype around if this regulation or this judgment happens, we're going to withdraw, or our services won't work as intended, or they won't be secure anymore. Do you think that is a risk for those companies? Because they often don't follow through on the threat, and I feel like they might be losing some trust with the legislators they work with the users that they have.
Absolutely. I mean, particularly in the California context, I covered really closely myself and my colleagues in California OpenAI's restructuring, and there was implicit in that process kind of this idea that, well, maybe OpenAI doesn't have to necessarily be a California company. I mean, particularly to state legislators and even the governor, that's scary. They want these companies to be in California. They want the tax revenue. They want to be able to say California is the fourth, fifth, whatever it may be, largest economy in the world, and tech is a big part of that. So it's certainly part of the playbook that companies use. We'll talk about the competition legislation that is going on in California, and that came up in that context as well. So it's definitely a saber they reach for pretty quickly.
Yeah, so on that point about the competition law in California, I think the EU treats California, or they like the idea that California is willing to regulate technology or privacy or competition. And they hope that it's kind of a mirror or a fast follow on EU regulations sometimes because of what is not coming out of Washington. But that's not always a great consolation prize. For example, California was thinking to have a Digital Markets Act, and that got killed off in committee a couple of weeks ago. Where are some of the differences and similarities in how California approaches tech regulation?
Yeah, I think this is one place where California really looks to what the EU has done and is planning to do to kind of influence its legislation. Legislatures come here to talk about how proposals might work. California is the only state in the union that has a privacy regulator. The federal government does not have one. That is very much based on European regulations. And then as far as what a state legislator in California is planning, a version of the Digital Markets Act, that was very much turned into a debate over whether or not that piece of regulation was working well right now. One side said it was, the other side said it was a disaster, that it was going to break all of the how the tech platforms function in California and destroy users' ability to use that tech. That's not a debate you're seeing happen at the federal level. And it's not wrong to call it kind of a consolation prize, but at the same time, all these companies are very much covered. A lot of these companies are very much covered by those rules in California. There is a larger bill that's still moving forward that would very much change and update the state's competition laws, and that would apply to all industries, not just tech, but would definitely take some inspiration from the DMA as well.
Mm-hmm. So there is similarity between California and the EU sometimes, but I wonder sort of how much EU thinking penetrates into a Silicon Valley company's mindset. And the example I have there is some members of the European Parliament got very annoyed this week that Anthropic wouldn't send somebody to a hearing to explain the Mythos model that they've decided not to release. And on one hand, I understand why a member of Parliament would want a large company to turn up and explain itself. And on the other hand, having worked at an AI startup, I just feel like that is the last thing on the minds of people in Anthropic. And unless you force them to turn up, they're just never going to turn up. Like, what are these companies thinking about when they hear the EU sort of sending one of these requests?
Yes. I think in the Anthropic context, they feel like they kind of have their hands full possibly right now. I don't want to speak for them, of course, but that they have their hands full dealing with the federal government. That's a complex relationship for them right now, and a very, very important one. So when calls come to go elsewhere and explain themselves, I think perhaps they have to focus on what's directly in front of them. But talk about companies like Anthropic and OpenAI that are worth, at least on paper, hundreds of billions of dollars. Mm-hmm. But these are still relatively new companies. They're still referred to as startups in some industry press. And I think that's instructive. You have to keep in mind that these companies are looking to IPO. They are still looking to raise money. There's this need in the United States to keep on top of what China is doing and beat them in the race. So I think that becomes the focus. And then they're dealing with plenty of regulation in California that a lot of them are trying to fend off. And I think it's not necessarily always the priority to deal with something outside of the immediate now of what they're dealing with in the States.
Mm-hmm. And then when it comes to use of AI, it's my experience, or it's my view, I think, that if you're not using the tools, it's very hard to have a sense of what they're good at and what they're not good at, and whether and how to regulate those tools. And I get the sense that whether it's in everyday life or at the level of corporate America, Americans are using AI to a much greater extent than in Europe. How much do you think that familiarity with the state of the art matters for getting regulation right if you're going to attempt it?
I think it makes a difference. I mean, a lot of the legislators I talk to, that they always have this preamble of they think AI is great. They think it's this wonderful revolution. They want to make sure it's a positive impact on people's lives. I mean, I think one thing that you do notice with a lot of tools back home is that you don't really have a lot of choice. AI is kind of being shoehorned into all of these products to find ways to make it work. So I think it's a familiarity. I don't know if it's necessarily born out of necessity, but it's just born out of this. That is kind of what the tech ecosystem is kind of turning into, even when you pop open a Word document. So maybe that creates that familiarity that leads to different kind of regulation.
Thank you very much, Chase. It's now time to head to a networking break. So grab a coffee, go chat with a new friend, and we'll see you back here at 11:15 for the next session on the future of cloud. Thank you.